We are almost at the end of the marathon for Georgia Pastor's School.
How are you doing? Is this your second year in this position now?
Starting my second year.
Wonderful.
It's been good.
I worked with Love
So I thought that I was going to get away with being behind the scenes, but I'll be a moderator for a moment or two here. We do have a floor mic if you have any questions. So if you do have a question, head that direction and we can just queue up at the floor mic. We're very appreciative of your response so far through the presentations and through worship, and we really hope this is useful to you. I told my Global Ministries friends that I'd been attending Georgia Pastor's School for a lot of years, and I wanted this to work really well so I could come back again next year, and I think they've done exceptionally well. Perhaps you can tell over the course of the days we tried to go from the big theme of the mission of God and the big theme of this global mission that's still very much alive and bring it home. Bring it home to the local context throughout Georgia. I would often in the emails over the year, I would say, now let's do this in a way that will work in Vidalia or Valdosta or Atlanta or up in the mountains. Because we all need help. As clergy and in our congregations, we need help. So do we have any questions? If so, if you'll move to the mic, and if you've got a question of a certain presenter, or if not, we'll pretty quickly maybe go to break. That's right. Any questions? All right, Matt, come on, get us started here. And you can direct it to an individual or to the entire group.
This is for Dr. Powe. He mentioned in his presentation that a lot of people come to our churches and they're scared to death when they come to our worship services. Could you kind of elaborate on that? Like a stranger walks in the church and they see us doing all this stuff they're not familiar with.
Yeah.
I mean, how can we change that?
So a couple of thoughts on what we can do. We have to remember that many of us are still working under assumption that most people have had some connection with church in their life and that they're familiar sort of with our practices. But the reality is more and more, less people have actually been in any form of a worship experience and are very unfamiliar with what we do. And if you think about a worship experience, which is hard for us because most of us have been a part of it for a number of years, but just thinking about the standing and sitting, and we use this language of the red UMH, or we use, if you use a different hymnal, and then if it's a communion Sunday, folk do this weird thing where they're taking this bread and drinking. I mean, all of these things to someone who's an outsider seems very strange and very different. So if that's your first experience of the church, that could be really overwhelming. So what we have to think about is what are some other entry points to invite people to where they could sort of connect and get a basic understanding of what it means to be a disciple and it not be worship as that first entry point. So some things to think about is, again, what are things you can do in a community where you invite people and have dialogue, where they can sort of meet individuals and have conversations with them, and it's not sort of this full-blown worship experience where they can fill out a place or feel like they might do the wrong thing, but it's more of I'm in a group setting where I can ask questions and talk with people and get to know people. So that would be one thing, is to think about more casual setting for people outside of the church where they can meet others. The second is, and this gets back particularly with younger people, is in the community engagement hours of when you're working with them in those settings where you're doing something together, and again, they're meeting people, that's a place where it's not in the sort of formal setting, but there's an activity usually taking place of building a house, you're working with individuals that may be unhoused or something else And that's a place where you can have conversation, but again, they don't feel like they're standing out. And it's a place, again, where they can get to know you. So that's a better place for them to engage in sort of learning who you are and what the church is about. So thinking about not such a formal setting, but a more casual setting for engaging others. And I know, Donna, if you all want to.
Can I add something to that? So, kiss your worship. Keep it simple, saints. So, you know, when somebody is coming in and it's their first time, if they're following the bulletin, stick to the bulletin. Sometimes you all like to improv, but if it's their first experience, it's like, oh, this is what this is. This is what you're supposed to do. And sometimes I know in my church, they would explain some of these liturgy pieces, like this is why we're doing this piece, or this is why this creed makes sense to us. So a little bit of explanation, especially if you know there are new people there. Just kiss your worship. Keep it simple, saints.
All right, any other questions? Yeah, step on up, Dan. Somebody was commenting about your bright red Georgia shirt. So it's very helpful with some of these outsiders to know.
This question is for Donna. When you were talking, wow, double mic. When you were talking about your church and you showed some of the pictures of your saints that were willing to buy in so quickly to that, I visualized some of my people who are like that where I'm at now. What about the rest of the church? How did you get them involved, bringing them into the same vision that everybody else, and that what you brought to the church too?
That's a good question. So one thing to keep in mind is that there weren't that many more people than the ones I showed you yesterday.
Oh.
So when we voted to sell our property, for example, which happened in my third week there, 26 people showed up. So that gives you a sense of how many people were still really committed to that congregation. But what I've also learned is that it only takes a couple of people who get your vision. And that part of our role is to spend time with the people who do get the vision, to continue to strengthen their capacity to share that vision and to embody that vision. And then we continue to expand. Some of the other really helpful advice I got when I first came to Mount Vernon Place was to start spending as much time as possible with the kind of people that I thought were eventually going to come. And that actually came from Scott Kisker, who was at Wesley at the time. And Scott advised me to start a small group at my kitchen table of the people who I thought would come. And so we started with 4 people plus myself, reading scripture together every Wednesday morning in my home, a small condo in DC. And 3 out of those 4 people ended up being some of the first people to join our church. So all it takes is just like a little bit of good yeast, all it takes is a little bit of good yeast to continue to expand the vision, and a little bit of bad yeast. You have to silence those voices as quickly as possible as well, and then to continue to build all at the same time. Is that helpful?
It is. My question, I guess, then would lead to this. When you talk about spreading vision, do you do it through sermons, Bible studies,
I
etc.?
think we regularly forget the power of our pulpits. And that was also extraordinarily helpful advice. Bishop Scholl was our bishop at the time, and Bishop Scholl called me on my second Sunday at Mount Vernon Place and asked for permission to come. I didn't think that that was a question I could say no to, right? But I was grateful that he gave me advanced warning. And instead of just showing up for worship that morning and patting me on the back and saying, "Good job, Pastor," he sent me an email and he critiqued my sermon. And it was some of the most helpful advice I've ever received, because part of what he said was all of my sermon illustrations were focused to the congregation that was there. They weren't focused on the people who we believed that God would eventually send to us. So I was preaching to the people who were there instead of to the folks who we wanted to come. And Bishop Scholl said, "Donna, you have to start preaching as though there are already young adults in your congregation, And he said, I promise you that young adults are going to come to your church. And he said, if you preach in a way that you're already targeting young adults or focusing your illustrations towards young adults, then when the young adults do come, they're going to know that you've been expecting them, but you're also going to preach to your oldest adults into knowing how to interact with young adults. And one of the great stories on that too, Lois was the finance chair who was 93 years old, and Lois knew that I met my husband on Match.com, and she could not figure this out for the life of her. And I was visiting Lois one time at the Methodist retirement community, and they were setting up new computers in the library of this retirement community. And Lois introduced me to the person setting up the computers, and she said, Sheila, this is my pastor. And do you know she got a man out of one of those? So I think the more I spoke, I was very intentional, though, about using the pulpit. I love that story. But I think we regularly forget that there is power. We have so much power when we mount that pulpit, and we cannot take that power for granted at all, and we have to use it to lead our folks. That's the most time that we have with the largest captive audience, and particularly when congregations are new and turn around. 98% of our time has to be focused on leading them into God's intended future.
And I just wanted to add, that is a great example of being outwardly focused. And the challenge we face is that even though you weren't meaning to do it, you're preaching to the people you see, which continues an inwardly focused mentality, instead of preaching to who you want to become, which then makes you an outwardly focused congregation. And that's exactly sort of what I'm trying to say in my presentation. We've got to move out of this inward-focused mentality, because what it does, it just reinforces all those things that we think we're trying to change.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And so that you use the phrase, the power of the pulpit inside the church. I wonder about the potential of the power of the pulpit or the church in the community.
I've not had Mr. Wesley's courage to go and preach on the corner. I run from those people. But that's...
Well, so when I was in Chicago, I was worshiping at a church called Urban Village Church, and one of the examples of sort of outside of the church was on Ash Wednesday, where we would ash on the streets in downtown Chicago, and I volunteered to do that one of those Sundays. And I think this was sort of the power of the pulpit on the streets. It was the scariest thing I had ever done, right? Like, wearing your collar in the middle of the streets out in Chicago. But the people that I was ashing would come up and they were like, so what does this mean? And it was just what you were saying, Doug, where those opportunities where they'd never encountered like even a religious act in that kind of way, and we were giving them permission to come and encounter sort of a religious act or experience. So it was one of the most wonderful mission opportunities of saying, hey, what if I'm just present? And I've heard other pastors who will just go into a bar and sit in the corner with their collar and just be present. So it's different ways of witnessing without witnessing, right? But a great invitation to say, hey, this is who I am, this is who I represent, and come, and I'm here with you, It'd be fascinating. I'm sure there's some of you who have tried that before, right?
Sitting at the bar, I once heard Bill Hybels talk about how he would always take his sermon to a bar on Saturday night, and he would be present, but what he would do was to sit and to watch everyone at that bar. And so he might watch a couple come in, and when they arrived at the bar, they were pretty happy together, and then watch them ignite in an argument or a disagreement. Or watch another person doing their very best to catch someone's attention, or as many people's as possible attention before the night had ended. And Bill talked about how he would sit with his manuscript and ask the question, If these people come to my church tomorrow, is there anything here for them? And that's a pretty powerful thing to think about as well. How are we preaching to the people who we believe that God is calling us to reach?
May I ask a question?
Oh, yes, please.
And it kind of dovetails with what you all, what bubbled up. I have come to find that many pastors and members of our congregation are introverted. And so I was wondering if you had any tips on how to motivate introverted people to go out, and what makes it maybe a little less scary or a little more easy, or is there a 3-step process or anything you can share?
It is an interesting phenom that people who are introverted seem to like to go into ministry. I'm going to just say that up front. I haven't quite figured that out yet. But a couple of things, and they may have some other suggestions, is I know a couple of individuals have said what really helps them is developing sort of a pattern so that they basically force themselves and say, I'm going to go to Starbucks. I like Starbucks, I'll use it. I'm going to go to Starbucks every Tuesday, and I'm going to talk to 5 people. One of the young pastors in Kansas City did this when he was starting a new church, because he was a new church pastor and he was introverted. But as a new church pastor, you've got to meet a lot of people and try to get things going. So he would force himself to go, he would force himself to talk to 5 people, and he followed that pattern, and it helped him to sort of break away from his withdrawal from individuals. So that was one thing that helped, was just sort of developing that pattern. The second thing I've known some individuals to do is that they don't like one-on-one conversations, but they're comfortable in groups. So, friends or other people would invite others, and then they would, in a group setting, be willing to engage people. They just didn't like the sort of one-on-one conversation with people. So those are the 2 things that I've known have helped people to sort of draw out and not be so introverted. I don't know.
I was gonna say, I have seen, because I would say I'm a borderline, so if I can be extroverted if I know what my role is in the situation. If I don't know what my role is, I just close up very quickly. And so what I have found, and I've heard others talk about this, is that maybe the first thing isn't to go, because I was thinking, my wife is very introverted in clergy, and if I go back and say to her, so Doug's idea is that you go to Starbucks once a week and talk to 5 people, she will be done with Doug in the Lewis Center. No, but at the same time, maybe the first step, taking the group piece, is finding places to volunteer and engage where you're out and about and there are natural reasons for conversations. So that, again, that's the part of me that I kind of want to know my role is. So I remember one time, I would cycle a lot on my own, and I was really intrigued by the cycling community. So I started volunteering through my work on Meals on Wheels. We started a cycling event. And I would go and take over one of the stands, and I would just go meet people as they came by. And that gave me a natural reason to have a lot of conversation with other volunteers and the cyclists. I still find the Starbucks thing a little scary. But yeah. I mean, just there are different ways to find the opportunity.
All right. Any other questions? We've got one coming this way. Yeah, and on behalf, how many introverts? So I'm introverted, but a lot of us, don't we have a passion or an interest or a hobby or something that gives us energy? And so often I find in the life of the church and in the life of the community, that can be a great outlet and a way that though we may need our quiet time, we'll also have that good time with others. Yes, sir.
A lot of young couples have fallen into the pattern of taking their family off on a special event on a weekend, Saturday and Sunday, go to some resort. I don't think I need to break their family time up. Is my ultimate goal to get them in church on Sunday, or do I need to take Sunday to them somehow on another day of the week? Or what's the future of the church building for them?
Great question.
I know a colleague of mine, Doug Lane, who serves at Wrightsville United Methodist Church on the beach in North Carolina, started jazz worship on Thursday nights this summer. I think sometimes we're so stuck on worship being on Sunday mornings at 11, and there could be, there are multitudes of people that we're missing out on. Our next experiments at Mount Vernon Place starts on Wednesday. We're starting it at 12:10 during the lunch hour, 35 minutes. It's called Faith Forum Express. It's a complete experiment. We're starting it for 5 weeks so that we can say it's an experiment and reevaluate. But 10 minutes of music. We have an extraordinary minister of music right now. 20 minutes in conversation on faith around a particular topic. And then time to pray, get to know your neighbor, and leave. It's a complete experiment. But I love looking at church as a canvas and not thinking about church as a calendar, that this is exactly how we have to do it. But what if we look at it as an artist canvas? And also keep using the word experiment so that we don't intimidate our members too much or make them nervous or afraid that everything's going to change. But how can we get into the place where we're constantly experimenting?
And can I add to that? If you are located in a place where there's beaches, etc., please make it easy for people to find you and find information about you and your worship. I don't know how many times I've gone on vacation to a beautiful place and I'm ready to go to worship on Sunday morning. There's nothing on the website about when you worship. You try to call and it's summer hours and they didn't tell you that it's summer hours, so you show up at 9 o'clock and the worship's really at 10:30. And so make it easy. If you are in those places, make it so that people can find you, and those who do go on vacation and worship can discover, okay, I do want to worship. There's a place right here, and we're a connection. So as United Methodists, if you know a group's going to vacation somewhere, say, hey, you're going to DC. You should go check out Mount Vernon Place. This is a great place to go and worship. So please, friends, help each other out. And then if you're in those places, make it so that it's easy to find you.
And I would affirm something that Donna said, because I do think the willingness to experiment is really important, and even to try out some of these services for a season, if that's what it takes. And I don't mean just summer season, though. I mean, we had experienced one time in a place where the church happened to have a great front porch in a very walkable community, and a lot of people traveled in the summers. And so we started doing Tuesdays on the porch and brought in bluegrass music, and it worked really well. And people knew that in the summer that was something that we added. But I've seen other places. There's a church, I can't remember where it is, it's around Charlotte, that's right in the area where a lot of the NASCAR organizations are based. They can't do Sundays. I mean, that community cannot do Sundays. And there are churches that have 100, 150 people on a Monday night, because that's when everybody's back. And if you get real into reading sometime, there's a document, I did just use the word document, called Mission Shaped Church. So if you're familiar with Fresh Expressions, but you go back 15 years, Mission Shaped Church was the first study of really the work of Fresh Expressions within the Methodist Church in England and the Anglican Church. And it's funny, because if you read it and they talk about changes in the culture and all the challenges they're facing with Sunday morning worship, you will read it and think to yourself, what insane person would plan worship on a Sunday? But the fun part is it is a decade and a half old at this point. It's probably 2 decades old in terms of what they were studying, and all of it is more true now than it was then.
And I would just add one other piece is, if you're thinking about those families, is have a conversation with those families and ask them, if we plan something on a Thursday, on a Wednesday, on a Tuesday, and, creative whatever, would you gather with us at that time to do something? So have a conversation with them, because too often, like I said, what we do is we just have an idea and we just do it, and it really doesn't meet the needs of the people we're actually trying to reach. So make sure you have a conversation with them so that hopefully you actually can reach the group you're trying to see.
So I
we have one more question. We're almost at time, so let's see if we
Okay.
can sneak this
I'll
in.
be real quick. That was very good what you said. Have a conversation with those families. And that's where I get kind of stuck because I don't know if I'm supposed to gather them up in my house and have a dinner and have almost like a meeting, or if I'm supposed to go around and have these individual conversations and then compile all this information, because that's time investment, and so I want to do it correctly. Thank you.
I'm going to let Donna and Amy answer also. I think it's a both and part of it is just how you're comfortable. I mean, because I'm going back to Donna had the meeting in her house with the small group, and that's the way she sort of did it. But I would say when you're trying to find out information, sometimes going with Russ said it may be better to start with a group because people may feel intimidated one-on-one, but in a group setting, they'll feel a little bit more comfortable, and people always like food, so feeding them is always a good thing. So that they would be willing to share information in that way. So I think that is a good place to start.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the questions. We'll continue the conversation at break. I do want to express a personal word of gratitude for my colleagues and friends and just this extraordinary gathering of people and of you as we've come together for this. And just so you know, some of this is very personal for me because I was a church outsider, didn't come to faith until I was 19, and came into a small church of 50 people. And that church really, they reoriented around a lot of us as teenagers as outsiders and made us insiders. So important stuff that can change the world, really.